When a humble black teacher took the stage at a wealthy fundraiser, a few donors laughed, mocking his suit, his voice, even his worth. But before he could walk off in shame, Keanu Reeves stood up, walked toward him, and said one line that silenced the entire room forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The ballroom shimmered with gold and glass. Downtown Los Angeles glittered through the windows like a sea of lights. And inside the Grand Horizon Hotel, laughter rose above the music of a polished jazz trio. Waiters glided between tables carrying champagne, caviar, and the illusion of generosity. The banner across the stage read, "Bridging the Gap in Education." But to anyone watching closely, it was clear the gap tonight wasn't just in education, it was in empathy. Wealthy donors in tailored suits spoke in rehearsed tones about opportunity and equality, yet their eyes darted toward celebrity faces, not toward the teachers sitting quietly in the corner. The real heroes of education looked out of place amid the glitter. Among them was Mr. David Carter, a middle-aged black teacher from a public high school in South Central Los Angeles. His gray suit was pressed carefully, the fabric slightly worn at the elbows, and the scuffed shoes he'd shined that morning reflected the chandelier's light like a symbol of effort trying to keep up with appearance. David sat beside a few fellow teachers, his posture straight but humble. His wife had ironed his shirt before he left home, whispering, "You belong there just as much as anyone." He wanted to believe her. He had been invited to speak as one of the few on-the-ground educators to share the challenges faced by underfunded schools. For weeks, he had practiced his speech after classes, long after his students had gone home. Every word came from experience, not policy. When the event host, a woman with pearls and a polished voice, announced his name, polite applause rippled across the room. David rose, adjusted his tie, and climbed the steps to the stage. He took a deep breath, smiled slightly, and began. "Good evening, everyone. My name is David Carter, and I teach history and civics to some of the brightest kids you'll ever meet." From the corner table near the bar, a donor whispered to his companion, "Is he the janitor?" The man chuckled softly, covering it with a sip of wine. Another leaned in and said, "You'd think they'd at least dress him for the occasion." The laughter was quiet, but sharp enough to cut through David's concentration. He hesitated, glancing toward them, but continued. "I've spent 22 years in the classroom," he said. "Most of my students come from families who can't afford new textbooks or lunch every day, but they show up, ready to learn. They remind me why education matters." His voice carried a steady conviction, but behind it was a lifetime of patience, the kind forged by surviving underestimation. At the back of the room sat Keanu Reeves, dressed simply in a dark suit, no entourage, no spectacle. He had come at the request of his friend Maria Sanders, a longtime education activist. Keanu listened intently, eyes focused not on the polished donors, but on the teacher at the microphone. He noticed the discomfort in the man's voice, the sidelong glances, the nervous pause before every sentence, as if David was fighting two battles at once, speaking his truth and surviving humiliation. When David mentioned a student who had walked 5 miles to school because his family's car broke down, a few people at the front table clapped half-heartedly. Others checked their phones. The atmosphere was polite, but detached. Then came the voice that broke it completely. Mr. Langford, a middle-aged real estate developer with a smirk that reeked of entitlement, raised his hand halfway through David's speech. "Excuse me," he said loudly enough for the whole room to hear. "This is very touching. Really. Maybe your students will be inspired to dress better next time they come to class." The room froze for a moment. Then laughter rippled among a few nearby guests. Some chuckled nervously, unsure if it was safe to join in. David's face drained of color. He looked down at his notes, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. His throat tightened. The words he had practiced 100 times vanished under the weight of mockery. Maria Sanders, sitting a few tables away, felt anger rise in her chest. She glanced toward Keanu, who was no longer seated. His chair pushed back slowly, his face unreadable. Keanu stood, hands at his sides, and began walking toward the stage. The sound of his footsteps on the marble floor echoed louder than any applause. Conversations died mid-sentence. Cameras turned. Even the jazz band stopped playing. David lifted his eyes, startled, as Keanu approached. The crowd whispered half disbelief, half curiosity. Everyone knew his face. Few expected what would happen next. Keanu climbed the steps, calm but unwavering. He stopped beside David, placed a hand on his shoulder, and turned to face the crowd. "Funny thing about dignity," Keanu said, his voice low but carrying through the room. "It doesn't come from a suit or a paycheck. It comes from people like this man. People who give everything so others can stand tall." Silence filled the room. Even Langford's smirk disappeared. And for the first time that night, real respect replaced the hollow clinking of champagne glasses. David stood frozen, uncertain if he should speak or step aside. But Keanu didn't move away. He stayed beside him, tall and calm, his hand steady on the teacher's shoulder like an anchor. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. Keanu turned slightly toward the audience. "You talk about bridging the gap in education," he said slowly. "But the biggest gap isn't in schools, it's right here, in this room, between those who teach and those who think their money makes them better." No one dared respond. The clinking of glasses had stopped. Even the air felt different, charged with something raw and uncomfortable. Langford shifted in his seat, his arrogance fading as eyes turned toward him. Keanu continued, "This man teaches lessons that no donation can buy, lessons about courage, perseverance, and dignity. If you can't see that, maybe you're the ones who need educating." The words landed like thunder. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the lights. Then, a single clap echoed. Maria Sanders had risen to her feet. Others followed, hesitant at first, then faster, until the entire room stood in applause. David's throat tightened. He looked at Keanu, overwhelmed, and whispered, "Thank you." Keanu smiled gently. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "They do." The cameras flashed, the applause continued. But amid all the noise, one truth became clear. Something far greater had been taught that night. Not in a classroom, not in a movie, but in a moment when one man's quiet courage met another's loud ignorance, and dignity won. As the applause thundered through the ballroom, David tried to steady his breathing. He had come expecting to be ignored, not defended by a man he'd never met. Cameras from local outlets swung toward him, capturing the tears glistening in his eyes. Yet he didn't feel like the center of attention. He felt seen, finally, as a teacher, as a man whose life's work mattered. Langford sank into his chair, his face pale, avoiding every camera lens that turned his way. The smirk he wore earlier had vanished. For the first time, he seemed to realize that his laughter had revealed more about himself than his money ever could. Keanu turned to David and said quietly, "Finish your speech." The teacher hesitated, then looked back at the microphone. His voice cracked as he began, but it grew stronger with every word. "I teach because I believe in my students," he said. "They deserve the same respect that any child does, no matter their zip code or the cost of their shoes." The crowd listened, silent now, without interruption or mockery. His closing line drew a new round of applause, this one honest and pure. When David stepped down, Keanu gave him a small nod. "You stood tall tonight," he whispered. Outside the ballroom, the city glowed under the night sky, unaware that inside one hotel, something small yet significant had shifted. A teacher had reclaimed his dignity, and a room full of elites had been forced to confront their own reflection. David walked out into the cool air, carrying nothing but his worn briefcase and a new kind of pride. Behind him, Keanu lingered, knowing this night was only the beginning of something larger. Hours before the gala, the sun dipped low over Los Angeles, casting long streaks of gold across the skyline. Keanu Reeves sat quietly in his modest apartment, scrolling through an email from his old friend, Maria Sanders. The subject line read, "Education Fundraiser, Tonight, you need to see this." Maria had been a close friend for years, a former teacher who became a passionate education activist. She devoted her life to fighting for schools forgotten by politicians and investors. Her message was simple. They're hosting a gala for education equality, but it's mostly talk. Real teachers like David Carter are being invited as tokens. I'd love for you to come. They need someone who listens. Keanu read the words twice, then set his phone down. He had no interest in spotlight appearances or speeches. But Maria's tone lingered in his mind, earnest, frustrated, hopeful. She was one of the few people who still spoke with conviction about things that mattered. He looked out the window at the city below, its glitter masking quiet struggles in classrooms miles away. He thought about his own life, the mentors who'd believed in him when he was just a drifting kid. Without them, he might never have found direction. That memory made the decision for him. By evening, Keanu slipped into a charcoal gray suit and drove himself downtown. No red carpet, no cameras. Just another guest in a city that worshipped wealth. The Grand Horizon Hotel towered ahead, its entrance glowing with photographers and luxury cars. He parked in the side lot, preferring anonymity. Inside, Maria spotted him immediately. Her face lit up with gratitude. "You actually came," she said, hugging him. He smiled faintly. "You said it mattered." Maria exhaled, shaking her head. "It does. You'll see why." As they walked through the marble corridor, Keanu noticed the contrast, the donors dripping in diamonds, the teachers standing awkwardly near the buffet table. He recognized that familiar imbalance, people talking about helping others while never seeing them as equals. Backstage, Maria introduced him to the night's speakers. Among them stood David Carter, holding a thin folder of notes. His suit was simple, his shoes slightly scuffed. But when he turned to greet Keanu, there was a quiet confidence in his eyes. "Mr. Reeves," he said, extending his hand. "I didn't expect to meet you here." "Please, call me Keanu," he replied warmly. "I heard you've got something important to share tonight." David chuckled softly. "I hope so. I'm not much of a public speaker, but my students, well, they give me courage." He studied the man's posture, his genuine humility. "You teach in South Central, right?" "Yes, sir. History and civics. We don't have much, but we make do. My students, they dream big. That's what keeps me going." Keanu smiled slightly. "That's the kind of power money can't buy." David nodded thoughtfully. "That's kind of you to say. Most people don't think teaching has power anymore." Keanu shook his head. "They're wrong." They spoke for only a few minutes, but it left an impression. Keanu could sense the man's sincerity, his exhaustion wrapped in quiet pride. When David walked away, clutching his notes, Keanu turned to Maria. "You were right. He's the real deal." Maria smiled sadly. "Too bad this room doesn't always value real." Keanu didn't reply, but he understood exactly what she meant. The gala had barely begun when Keanu sensed the strange atmosphere. Waiters moved briskly, their smiles rehearsed. Politicians gathered near the cameras, and donors competed over who had given the largest check. Every table had a plaque displaying a sponsor's name in gold letters. Yet, in the middle of all that glamour, the teachers were seated along the back wall, almost as decoration. Maria whispered, "See? They want teachers on stage for optics, not for insight." Keanu glanced around. "I can feel that," he said quietly. "It's like they're applauding themselves." Maria sighed. "That's why I wanted you here. You don't play that game." When the host began her introduction, Keanu watched the guests closely. Every speech sounded polished, perfectly worded, but hollow. Executives used words like empowerment and equality as if they were brand slogans. Nobody mentioned overcrowded classrooms, broken textbooks, or teachers working 2 jobs just to afford supplies. Between speeches, Maria pointed out David again. He was seated alone at his table, practicing his notes one last time, his lips moving silently. "He's nervous," she said. "This is his first big event. He came straight from teaching all day." Keanu looked at him with quiet respect. "That's a real man right there." Maria nodded. "You'll see. He doesn't complain. He just shows up every day." His students love him. A soft piano tune began playing. The host announced a 5-minute break before the next presentation. Keanu stepped away from his table and approached David, who was sipping water by the curtain backstage. "You ready?" Keanu asked. David chuckled, though his hands trembled slightly. "As ready as I'll ever be." "Don't worry about them," Keanu said. "Just speak from your heart. The truth doesn't need polish." David smiled faintly. "Thanks. That means a lot." Keanu studied him for a moment. There was something deeply genuine about the man. His humility didn't come from weakness, but from purpose. Minutes later, as David's name was called, Keanu returned to his seat beside Maria. The lights dimmed, and the teacher stepped onto the stage, gripping the microphone like a lifeline. Maria whispered, "He's got a good speech, but they'll judge him the moment he opens his mouth." Keanu didn't take his eyes off the stage. "Then maybe it's time someone reminded them what real class looks like." He said it softly, almost to himself, unaware of how prophetic those words would soon become. As the lights dimmed and David began to speak, Keanu's attention sharpened. The teacher's voice carried warmth but also nerves, the kind that come from years of being overlooked. His words painted vivid pictures of classrooms filled with hope and struggle, kids sharing worn-out textbooks, parents working 2 jobs, teachers paying for supplies out of pocket. Each sentence revealed quiet heroism, the kind the Gala's donors claimed to celebrate but rarely understood. At the nearby table, 2 businessmen whispered, "Heartwarming, isn't it?" One said with a smirk, "Almost makes you forget the numbers." His friend chuckled. "He's passionate, I'll give him that. Just doesn't belong in this room." Keanu heard them. His jaw tightened, though his expression stayed calm. He wasn't shocked by their words. He'd seen that same arrogance in Hollywood, in boardrooms, in places where people mistook wealth for worth. But hearing it now, directed at someone who gave his life to teaching children, felt different. It stung. Maria leaned closer to him. "This is what I meant," she whispered. "They love the idea of teachers, just not the reality." Keanu nodded slowly. Not for long. As David spoke about his students' resilience, Keanu felt the weight of the moment. He could sense the man's sincerity trembling under the pressure of judgmental eyes. When David told the story of a student who had taught himself to read by flashlight during power outages, Keanu saw heads shake not in admiration, but in disbelief. He thought back to his earlier words backstage, "That's the kind of power money can't buy." It echoed in his mind, like a promise he hadn't realized he'd made. By the time David's voice cracked near the end of his speech, Keanu knew exactly why he was there. Not as a guest, not as a celebrity, but as a witness. He stayed still, waiting for what was coming, unaware that the night's quiet tension was about to ignite into something unforgettable. The laughter that would soon follow the disrespect that would humiliate David in front of everyone would be the spark that turned an ordinary fundraiser into a moment the world would never forget. The microphone picked up every breath as David Carter began his speech. His voice was steady at first, calm and deliberate, shaped by years of speaking to students who sometimes didn't want to listen, but eventually did. He told the crowd about the bright faces in his classroom, the kids who asked impossible questions, and the small victories that kept him coming back each morning. "I once had a student named Malik," David said, glancing at his notes. "He couldn't afford shoes. Every day he walked 5 miles to school in worn-out sneakers that barely held together. I asked him once why he did it, and he told me, 'Because my mom says school is where I get my power.'" His voice softened. "That boy reminded me that education isn't charity, it's dignity, it's strength." At a corner table near the front, a group of wealthy donors shifted uncomfortably. They were dressed in suits so sharp they looked like armor. One of them, a man in his 50s with slick-back hair and a diamond watch, Mr. Langford, leaned toward his wife and whispered something under his breath. She laughed, the kind of laugh that dripped with cruelty, disguised as amusement. Another man at the same table smirked and muttered, "Cute story." Their wives covered their mouths politely, pretending not to giggle. David hesitated, his words catching. He glanced in their direction, uncertain if he'd heard correctly. He'd faced disrespect before in classrooms, in meetings, but something about this felt sharper. It wasn't ignorance, it was arrogance. Keanu Reeves noticed the shift immediately. From his seat halfway back, he leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't interrupt, but his body stilled. Maria Sanders beside him whispered, "They're mocking him." Keanu's expression didn't change. He simply said, "I know." David cleared his throat and continued, "We talk a lot about numbers, about test scores, and graduation rates. But what I see every day are kids who refuse to give up, kids who teach me what strength really means." He paused, hoping to reconnect with the audience, but the room had already divided. Some guests listened politely. Others scrolled through their phones or murmured to one another, as if the teacher's real-life stories were less interesting than their next business deal. When David spoke about organizing weekend tutoring sessions using his own paycheck, one young socialite near Langford's table tilted her head and said loudly enough for others to hear, "Oh, how poetic." A few people snickered. The sound rolled across the room like quiet thunder. Maria's fists tightened beneath the tablecloth. She looked at Keanu, her voice trembling with anger. "This is what I warned you about." David's eyes darted toward the exit for a split second. He didn't want to break down in front of them. He'd fought too long to be here. But humiliation has a way of finding cracks in even the strongest spirit. Keanu leaned forward, jaw tight. He had seen cruelty in many forms, but this one, wrapped in sophistication and money, was the hardest to stomach. David tried to focus on his notes again, but the words blurred under the glare of the stage lights. He could feel eyes on him, not admiration, but condescension. The laughter still echoed faintly in his mind, each chuckle slicing deeper than any insult ever spoken directly. He'd dealt with disrespect before, but never in a room full of people claiming to care about education. He took a shallow breath, lifted his head, and forced a small smile. "Some of my students live in neighborhoods where sirens are louder than morning alarms," he said. "Yet they show up, they dream big, they believe their stories matter." A man in the back clapped once, half-heartedly, then stopped when no one joined in. The silence that followed felt almost hostile. David glanced down again. His voice cracked slightly as he continued, "I tell them that one day they'll stand tall. That they'll sit at tables where people respect them for their ideas, not their income." At that, Langford chuckled again. "We'll see about that," he muttered to his table, his words barely audible but dripping with arrogance. Keanu's eyes shifted to Langford's table. His calm exterior didn't change, but his focus sharpened like steel. Maria caught the look in his eyes, the kind that came right before he decided to act. Meanwhile, David stumbled over his next line. He could feel the temperature in the room change, not physically, but emotionally. He'd lost them. He could tell. The ones who mattered most, the donors, weren't listening. They were waiting for the next celebrity to take the spotlight. Still, he pushed through. "Every child deserves a chance," he said softly, "even if the world doesn't see them." He looked out across the crowd, hoping for connection, but all he found were blank faces and glittering wine glasses. The applause that followed was sparse and polite, the kind of clapping people do to be courteous, not because they care. Langford leaned back in his chair, swirling his champagne. "Beautiful words, teacher," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Maybe next year you'll win Best Costume." Laughter erupted. It wasn't the whole room this time, just a pocket of it, but it was enough. David froze. His lips parted, but no words came out. The microphone buzzed softly in the silence that followed, the sound of humiliation filling every corner of the ballroom. Maria gasped quietly. "Unbelievable," she whispered. Keanu's eyes never left the stage, his chair pushed back slowly, scraping against the marble floor. He didn't look at Maria or anyone else. His expression was calm, but his jaw was tight, his movements deliberate. David lowered his head, gripping the edges of the podium. He looked ready to walk off, and that's when Keanu stood up. Every head turned. The laughter died instantly. Even Langford's grin faltered as the actor began walking toward the front of the room. The room fell into a tense, heavy silence as Keanu moved toward the stage. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor, calm yet commanding. No one spoke. Even the waiters froze where they stood, balancing trays mid-air. David looked up from the podium, startled. His eyes widened as Keanu approached, his dark suit blending with the shadows while his presence drew every gaze. The quiet murmur of cameras clicking began again, unsure if they were witnessing a performance or a reckoning. Langford shifted in his chair, trying to smile, but the smirk didn't hold. His wife leaned away from him, embarrassed. Around them, whispers rippled. Is he really going up there? What's happening? Keanu climbed the short steps and stopped beside David. He placed a steady hand on the teacher's shoulder. The gesture was simple, but the meaning behind it was immense. Solidarity, respect, defiance. He turned toward the audience. You laugh at the man who teaches your children's future, he said softly. You mock the one who gives what money can't buy. Is that what this night stands for? No one replied. Heads bowed. Langford stared down at his plate. Keanu's voice stayed low, but it carried through the entire hall. You talk about equality, about bridging the gap. But the gap isn't in education, it's in humility. This man is doing what most of us never could. He's building the world from the ground up. He looked at David, his tone softening. You've already taught more tonight than anyone here. Maria rose from her seat first, clapping slowly. The sound echoed, lonely at first. Then others followed. One by one, people stood, applause spreading like a wave until the entire ballroom was on its feet. David blinked hard, trying to hold back tears. He managed a small nod, his voice trembling as he whispered, "Thank you." Keanu turned to him and said quietly, "Don't thank me. You earned this moment." The light shimmered above them, reflecting off tears, glasses, and applause. For the first time that evening, the fundraiser lived up to its name. The gap had been bridged not by wealth or speeches, but by dignity. The sound of applause faded into an uneasy silence as Keanu stood beside David at the podium. The lights reflected softly off the polished wood, casting both men in a halo of gold. All around them, the crowd whispered in disbelief. "Is that really Keanu Reeves?" Someone murmured. "What's he doing?" Another whispered. Keanu didn't answer anyone. He didn't need to. His calm presence spoke louder than words. He looked at David, then slowly turned to face the audience, an audience suddenly stripped of its arrogance. His hand remained on David's shoulder, steady and reassuring. His voice, when it came, was quiet but powerful. "You know," he began, "I've met many actors in my life. Some of them play heroes on the big screen. But this man right here, he doesn't play one. He is one." A wave of stillness rolled through the hall. The cameras that had been poised for social photos now lifted, recording every second. Keanu took a breath, his tone even and deliberate. "You laugh because you don't understand. But this man is teaching lessons that no movie, no script, no amount of money could ever teach: dignity, perseverance, compassion." The words struck the air like a chord that couldn't be unheard. Langford, sitting stiffly at his table, swallowed hard. His eyes darted downward, his smirk gone. Keanu continued, his gaze sweeping over the tables of donors and executives. "You came here tonight to talk about bridging the gap in education. But the truth is, that gap isn't in our schools. It's right here, in this room, between those who build the world and those who think their wealth gives them permission to look down on others." No one moved. No one dared breathe too loudly. He let the silence linger, then added softly, "When you mock someone for their clothes or their salary, you don't reveal their lack of worth. You reveal your own poverty, the poverty of spirit." Maria Sanders blinked back tears. She had fought for years to make people listen, but in just a few words, Keanu had turned a ballroom full of indifference into a mirror of reflection. David stood motionless beside him, his head slightly bowed, unsure whether to speak or step back. Keanu glanced at him gently and said, "You don't have to say anything. They've heard enough." A few guests lowered their eyes in shame. Others looked around awkwardly, caught between guilt and admiration. Then, somewhere near the back, someone began to clap. It was slow at first, a single pair of hands echoing through the vast room. Another joined, then another. Within moments, the entire crowd was on its feet. Applause thundered across the hall, but it wasn't the shallow kind that followed wealth or fame. It was the sound of awakening. David blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. His voice caught as he whispered to Keanu, "I don't know what to say." Keanu smiled softly. "You already said everything that mattered." The applause swelled louder, filling the ballroom with a warmth that had been missing all night. For the first time, the teacher who came to represent the forgotten stood taller than anyone else in the room. As the applause continued, David could barely process what was happening. The faces that had mocked him minutes earlier were now watching with awe. Some clapped hesitantly, others with genuine conviction, but every person in that room knew something had shifted. Keanu raised his hand slightly, signaling for calm. The noise softened until the room was quiet again. His expression stayed steady, calm, centered, the way someone speaks when truth itself gives them strength. He said, "We live in a world that measures success by the weight of a wallet instead of the worth of a heart. But look at this man. He spends his days shaping young minds, teaching them to stand tall in a world that often looks down. And for that, he deserves more honor than anyone who hides behind their money." He paused, scanning the room. Langford sat frozen in his chair, avoiding eye contact. The earlier laughter now felt like poison in the air, something everyone wanted to distance themselves from. Keanu continued, "When I was younger, I met a teacher like him. I didn't have much. I was lost, angry, trying to make sense of the world. But that teacher believed in me when no one else did. He taught me something I never forgot, that kindness doesn't cost a thing, but cruelty always leaves a debt unpaid." Even the servers stood at the edges, hands clasped, drawn in by the sincerity of his words. Keanu looked back at David, his tone softening again. "You remind me of that man. The world doesn't make enough of you. But tonight, they will remember your name." David's throat tightened. He didn't move, afraid that if he spoke, his emotions would betray him. Keanu turned back to the crowd one last time. "So, let's stop pretending that prestige equals virtue. Let's stop mistaking arrogance for confidence. Tonight was supposed to be about education, wasn't it? Then, let's learn something real dignity isn't given. It's lived." The audience rose again, this time without hesitation. Applause filled the hall until it was deafening. Some people wiped away tears. Others nodded quietly, ashamed but grateful for the truth. Maria stood near her table, clapping so hard her hands ached. She looked toward Keanu and mouthed, "Thank you." David turned slightly, meeting Keanu's eyes. The tears finally came, not from embarrassment, but from release. For years, he had been fighting a silent battle against invisibility. Tonight, someone had seen him, truly seen him. Keanu leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." The applause roared again, but neither man moved. For that brief moment, under the bright ballroom lights, the teacher and the actor stood as equals. The ovation went on longer than anyone expected. It wasn't polite or rehearsed. It was real, the kind that made even the cynical feel something shift deep inside. David lowered his gaze, overwhelmed, but Keanu kept a steady hand on his shoulder, grounding him. The two men stood side by side as the applause washed over them like a tide of long overdue respect. When it finally began to fade, Keanu spoke once more, his voice quiet yet cutting through the silence with ease. "You don't have to wear a tuxedo to be great. You don't have to earn millions to make an impact. What you give to others from the goodness of your heart, that's what defines greatness." He stepped back from the microphone, glancing toward Langford's table without saying his name. "I think some of us forgot that tonight." Langford shifted uneasily, his fingers tapping against his glass. He didn't look up. No one laughed this time, Not one person dared. Keanu turned back to David. "Your students are lucky," he said simply. "You're doing the real work, the kind that changes the world one child at a time." David found his voice at last. "Thank you," he whispered, though his words trembled with emotion. "Not for defending me, but for defending what I stand for." Keanu smiled gently. "That's why I'm here." The audience erupted again, rising to their feet. Flashbulbs flared as reporters captured the moment, the image of Keanu Reeves standing beside a humble teacher, the two men united in purpose and integrity. Maria joined them at the front, tears shining in her eyes. She wrapped her arms briefly around David, whispering, "You deserved this moment." Then she turned to Keanu, adding softly, "And you gave it to him." He shook his head. "No," he said. "He earned it long before tonight." The applause grew until it filled every corner of the ballroom. For the first time all evening, the event's title, Bridging the Gap in Education, felt real. The gap wasn't about money or schools. It was about respect. And that night, in one act of courage and compassion, the bridge was finally built. The applause eventually faded, replaced by a heavy, reflective hush. People began to move again, but slower now, quieter, as if afraid to disturb the moment that had just unfolded. David stepped away from the podium, still dazed, his breathing unsteady. He could hardly believe what had happened. The same crowd that had laughed at him minutes ago had risen to honor him. He had never seen power change a room like that. Backstage, the noise of the ballroom softened behind the curtain. David leaned against the wall, clutching the edge of a small table for balance. His hands trembled, his pulse racing. Keanu followed him a few steps later, his calm demeanor unchanged, though his eyes carried concern. "You okay?" Keanu asked quietly. David exhaled shakily. "I think so. I wasn't expecting any of this. You didn't have to do that." Keanu shook his head. "I did, because silence helps bullies thrive." David met his eyes, surprised by the firmness in his tone. Keanu added, "You were telling the truth, and truth deserves to be protected." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air felt thick with unspoken gratitude. Then a burst of camera flashes broke through the curtain as several reporters hurried backstage shouting questions. "Mr. Reeves, can we get a comment? Why did you get involved? What message were you trying to send?" Keanu raised a hand politely. "Tonight wasn't about me," he said simply. "It was about respect and the people who earn it every day without asking for it." The reporters tried again, but he turned away, making it clear the conversation was over. He nodded toward David, signaling that he, not the actor, was the real story. But David looked uneasy. He wasn't used to attention, especially the kind that came with flashing lights and microphones. Maria Sanders appeared then, pushing gently through the crowd. Her eyes were glassy with emotion. "You held your ground," she said, hugging David tightly. "That's more powerful than any donation they'll make tonight." He managed a small smile. "I didn't hold much ground," he murmured. "I nearly walked off, but you didn't," Maria said firmly. "And that's what matters." Keanu stood nearby, silent but thoughtful. His gaze drifted toward the main room where guests were still talking in hushed tones. The mood had changed, completely gone was the smug laughter and idle gossip. Now, people looked introspective, uncomfortable even, as if confronting parts of themselves they didn't like. At the far end of the ballroom, Langford stood alone at the bar, staring into his untouched drink. His reflection in the glass looked smaller somehow, stripped of the confidence that had carried his earlier mockery. Cameras were still turning his way, catching his discomfort. He could feel it, the humiliation of being seen for what he'd done. For the first time, he had no words. Maria noticed him and shook her head. "Poetic justice," she muttered softly. Keanu didn't answer. His attention had shifted elsewhere. An idea was forming, something that reached beyond the walls of this ballroom, beyond the applause. The crowd began to disperse, their conversations softer now, stripped of the arrogance that had filled the room earlier. Some guests stopped by to shake David's hand, speaking words that sounded sincere, though he could tell many of them were driven by guilt more than understanding. Still, he accepted each handshake graciously, knowing small gestures could mean the start of change. Maria stayed close to him, ensuring reporters didn't swarm too close. Keanu stood a few steps away, quietly observing. He never liked being the center of attention, and he could sense David's discomfort mirrored his own. Finally, the reporters left, their cameras flickering off one by one. Only a few volunteers remained, stacking chairs and collecting empty glasses. The jazz band had already packed up, leaving behind the faint echo of a night that had gone far differently than planned. David rubbed his temples, exhausted. "I think I'm going to head home," he said softly. "My wife's probably still awake. She'll never believe what happened." Maria touched his arm gently. "Take pride in it, David. You reminded them what teaching really means." He smiled faintly. "I'm not sure I reminded anyone. Feels like Keanu did all the talking." Keanu turned to him and said, "No, you did the hard part. You stood there when they laughed. That took more courage than anything I said." David lowered his eyes. "I just did what I always do, show up." "And that," Keanu replied, "is exactly why it mattered." The three of them shared a quiet pause. The weight of the evening hung in the air, bittersweet, humbling, transformative. From across the room, Langford still stood alone. He had moved away from the bar, but his expression hadn't changed. He kept glancing toward the door, as if looking for an escape. His friends had already left, unwilling to face the cameras or the shame that came with association. For once, the man who prided himself on commanding every room now looked invisible. The same spotlight he once craved now burned too bright to stand under. Maria caught Keanu's gaze. "Think he learned anything tonight?" Keanu exhaled slowly. "Maybe. But real lessons take time." David nodded in agreement. "I teach teenagers. I've learned that embarrassment fades faster than wisdom." That made Keanu smile faintly. "Then let's make sure tonight doesn't fade." Maria raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked back toward the stage where David had spoken earlier, where one man's quiet truth had exposed the hollowness of 1,000 polite lies. Something in his expression shifted from calm to purpose. "I have an idea," he said finally. The ballroom had nearly emptied when Keanu finally spoke again. His voice was low, thoughtful, as if each word was still forming from conviction. "Maria, you've been fighting this battle for years. Teachers like David are out there every day doing the impossible. What if tonight wasn't just a moment? What if it became something lasting?" Maria looked intrigued. "You mean like awareness?" Keanu shook his head. "Awareness fades. I'm talking about something tangible. Something that puts real support in the hands of people who deserve it." He turned to David. "You told me earlier your students dream big, even when they have nothing. Let's make sure they don't have to dream alone." David blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. "Keanu, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to help build something in your name," Keanu replied. "A scholarship, maybe. Something that keeps your message alive long after tonight." For a moment, David couldn't speak. The exhaustion, the adrenaline, and the shock of the evening blended into one overwhelming feeling. "I don't know what to say," he finally whispered. "Say yes," Maria said gently. "Because this could change lives," Keanu nodded. "We'll talk details later. For now, just rest. You've earned it." David's eyes filled again, but this time, not from humiliation, from gratitude. He extended his hand to Keanu. "You stood up when you didn't have to. That means more than any headline ever could." Keanu clasped his hand firmly. "The headlines don't matter. The kids do." Outside, the night air was cool and quiet. David stepped out first, his old briefcase in hand, walking into the glow of streetlights. He didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a teacher in a forgotten district, but as a man whose purpose mattered. Back inside, Keanu and Maria lingered by the now dark stage. "You really meant it, didn't you?" Maria asked softly. Keanu looked toward the empty podium. "Completely. And in that stillness, the spark of an idea became a promise that what began as one man's humiliation would soon turn into hope for thousands. Long before the gala lights and the humiliation, there was a small classroom in South Los Angeles that smelled of chalk dust, hope, and exhaustion. The walls were faded yellow, the paint chipped from years of neglect. The desks were mismatched and scarred by initials carved by students long gone. When it rained, a steady drip fell from a cracked ceiling tile into a plastic bucket near the door. This was where David Carter taught history and civics to the kids the system forgot. His students came from families fighting every day to stay afloat. Single parents, factory workers, bus drivers, and janitors. Some students came to class hungry, others tired from watching their younger siblings all night while their parents worked the graveyard shift. But every morning, David stood at the door, greeting each one with the same warm smile and the same words, "Glad you made it." He had no state-of-the-art technology, no fancy smart boards or gleaming facilities. What he had was belief. Belief that every kid, no matter where they came from, had something brilliant inside them, waiting to be seen. On Fridays, when spirits were low and the week had been too hard, he brought in an old speaker from home. He played music, jazz, old soul, sometimes even classical, and told his students to close their eyes and imagine the world they wanted to live in. Then he'd say, "Now open your eyes and start building it." When the district cut the art budget, David spent his own money on supplies. He bought paint, paper, and glue, just so his students could have one creative outlet. When the heaters broke in winter, he brought in blankets from home. And when one of his students, a shy boy named Jamal, confessed he didn't have lunch money, David started packing 2 sandwiches instead of 1. After school, he stayed late, tutoring whoever needed extra help. His wife often called to remind him dinner was getting cold, and he'd laugh, promising he'd be home soon. But he rarely left before the sky turned orange. One evening, a student named Tyrone lingered after everyone else had gone. He was tall for his age, but quiet, a kid with a rough exterior hiding a sharp mind. He sat on top of a desk, tapping his pencil. "Mr. C," Tyrone asked, "why do you stay here? You could teach somewhere nicer, like up in Santa Monica or Glendale. You'd make more money, and people would actually listen to you." David looked up from his papers, smiling faintly. "Because someone stayed for me." Tyrone frowned. "What do you mean?" "When I was your age," David said, leaning back in his chair, "I had a teacher named Mrs. Grant. She didn't give up on me, even when I gave up on myself. I was angry, lost, ready to quit school. But she kept showing up, every single day. And one day I realized, if someone could care about me that much, maybe I should care too." Tyrone nodded slowly, his voice softening. "So you stayed because she did?" David smiled. "Exactly. And maybe one day, you'll stay for someone else." Years passed, but the classroom never changed much. The walls peeled a little more, the desks wobbled a little worse, yet David kept showing up. He carried the same worn leather bag, patched at the corners, stuffed with lesson plans, handouts, and extra pencils for the students who could never afford them. He'd seen generations of kids come and go, some thriving, others disappearing into the streets. Every name stayed with him. He could still recall the sound of Malik's laugh, the determination in Rose's handwriting, the quiet brilliance of a boy named Darren who fixed broken computers from discarded parts. There were nights when David felt the weight of failure pressing down on him. After parent-teacher conferences where no parents came, he'd sit alone in his car outside the school, staring at the flickering streetlight, wondering if any of it mattered. Yet every time he thought about leaving, something pulled him back. A note slipped onto his desk, reading, "Thank you for believing in me." A small voice saying, "You make school feel safe." Those words became his fuel. He learned how to teach with humor. When the heater broke in January, he told the kids, "At least history will feel real. This is how Washington felt in Valley Forge." The class laughed and stayed wrapped in their coats as they worked through their essays. He turned every hardship into a lesson. When a student complained about broken lockers, David said, "That's how life works sometimes. You fix what's broken, not because it's easy, but because it's yours." There was one afternoon he'd never forget. A boy named Raymond, often silent and withdrawn, stayed behind after class. He approached David's desk slowly, clutching a folded piece of notebook paper. "I wrote something," he said nervously. David unfolded it. It was a poem titled, "The Man Who Stayed." The final line read, "You stayed when others left, and now I believe I can stay too." David felt tears sting his eyes. "This is beautiful," he said quietly. "Keep writing." "I will," Raymond replied. "You make me want to." Moments like that became his wealth, the currency of meaning that no paycheck could measure. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need a gala. He only needed to see one spark light up in a student's eyes. Every night, when the halls were empty and the janitors began sweeping, David closed his classroom door slowly, turning off the lights with a quiet sense of fulfillment. Exhausted but proud, he would whisper the same words to himself. One more day, done. One more difference, made. Years later, David would still remember those nights. The ones where he'd walk the empty hallways, long after the final bell, the soft hum of fluorescent lights echoing above him. He'd pause by the classroom door, looking back one last time at the rows of desks, some cracked, some crooked, but each one representing a story, a life, a chance. He never wanted fame, and he never dreamed of standing on stages. His greatest victories were small and quiet. A student who finally passed a history exam. A parent who stopped by to say thank you. A child who once sat in silence, now leading class discussions with confidence. He thought often about Mrs. Grant, the teacher who once refused to give up on him. He kept a framed photo of her on his desk, faded with age. Beneath it was a note she'd written him in high school. "David, never forget, you were made to lift others higher." He carried those words with him through every disappointment and every triumph. Sometimes, when the rain came down hard and the roof leaked again, he'd take a mop from the janitor's closet, humming softly as he cleaned the puddles. The kids would tease him, "Mr. C, why don't you complain?" And he'd just smile. "Because the roof might leak," he'd say, "but the spirit doesn't have to." He believed teaching was sacred work, an act of faith in people who hadn't yet learned to believe in themselves. And though he often returned home exhausted, he never regretted a single day. That night after the gala, when the laughter and humiliation echoed in his mind, he remembered all of this: the classroom, the students, the small victories that no one had ever applauded. He realized that those moments, not the glittering ballroom or the shallow approval of donors, were what defined him. He never sought recognition. He only wanted his kids to know that they mattered, that they could stand tall even when the world looked down on them. And as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, one thought settled in his heart. Even if the world forgot his name, the lessons he taught would live forever in the lives he'd touched. The morning after the gala, Los Angeles woke to a storm, one that didn't come from the sky, but from the internet. Within hours, the clip of Keanu Reeves standing beside David Carter had spread across every platform imaginable. Someone in the audience had captured the entire exchange, from Langford's insult to the standing ovation. The video was titled, "Keanu Reeves Shuts Down Elitism at Gala Calls Out Wealthy Donors in Defense of Teacher." It took less than 3 hours to hit 1 million views. By sunrise, it was everywhere. Morning shows replayed the clip with commentary. News anchors used words like humility, class, and courage. Teachers across the country began sharing it on social media, adding their own messages. He spoke for all of us. Finally, someone stood up for educators. That teacher is every one of us trying to be heard. Meanwhile, David woke to a phone that wouldn't stop buzzing. His voicemail was full, his inbox overflowing with messages from reporters and strangers alike. It was overwhelming. His wife, Angela, looked at him in disbelief as she poured coffee. "You're trending, honey," she said with a smile that mixed pride and concern. David rubbed his eyes. "Trending for what? I didn't even do anything." "You did more than you think," she said. "You showed grace." And someone noticed. He tried to brush it off, but curiosity got the better of him. When he finally opened his phone, the first thing he saw was Keanu's hand resting on his shoulder. the photo that had gone viral overnight. Beneath it were thousands of comments praising the moment. Words like honor, dignity, and hope filled his screen. It didn't feel real. He wasn't used to attention. He was used to chalk dust and after-school tutoring, not headlines and hashtags. Still, a small part of him, one he didn't often listen to, felt something stir. Maybe, he thought, maybe people do care. By the time he arrived at school that morning, the story had already spread through the halls. The teachers greeted him with wide smiles, some clapping him on the back as he walked by. "Mr. C, you're famous," one of his colleagues joked. David laughed awkwardly. "Don't start that." When he stepped into his classroom, a burst of cheers erupted from his students. They had seen the video too. Even the quietest kids looked at him differently, their faces glowing with pride. A shy girl near the front, Janelle, raised her hand timidly. "Mr. C, is it true Keanu Reeves stood up for you?" David tried to downplay it, something like that. "But, Mr. C," she insisted, "you're on TikTok. My mom watched it twice." The class erupted in laughter. David chuckled, shaking his head. All right, let's stick to fractions, okay?" But as he turned to the whiteboard, he couldn't stop the warmth spreading through his chest. Maybe, for the first time, the world had heard the voice of people like him, the teachers who gave everything and asked for nothing. Throughout the day, the world outside his classroom buzzed like never before. News outlets wanted interviews. Talk shows requested guest appearances. Bloggers dissected every line of Keanu's speech. Yet, inside room 204, life went on almost the same. The students still struggled with fractions, papers still piled high, and the heater still rattled whenever it turned on. But something invisible had shifted. During lunch, David sat at his desk scrolling through his phone. Teachers from across the country had tagged him in posts. One video showed educators in Ohio clapping in their teacher's lounge after watching the clip. Another was from a rural school in Texas with the caption, "Finally, someone stood up for us. Thank you, Mr. Carter." He felt a lump form in his throat. It was strange being seen by strangers, appreciated by people he'd never met, yet the attention made him uneasy. He didn't want to become a symbol or a headline. He just wanted to teach. Angela called during his lunch break. "They're talking about you on Good Morning America," she said. "And Keanu, too." They called it the dignity moment. David groaned softly. "I didn't ask for any of this, Ang." "I know," she said gently. "But maybe it's not about asking. Maybe it's about finally being seen." He didn't know how to respond. For years, he'd fought against invisibility, the quiet erosion of morale that came with teaching in forgotten neighborhoods. Now that people finally noticed, he didn't know what to do with it. When the bell rang, the kids returned for the afternoon session. Their energy was infectious. A few whispered to each other, clearly still talking about the video. Janelle, the quiet girl from earlier, slipped him a folded note before sitting down. After class, he opened it. It read, "Thank you for not walking off that stage. You made me proud to be your student." He sat in his chair for a long moment, reading it again and again. That simple note meant more than every headline. Later that evening, when the last student left, David stayed behind. The classroom was silent, except for the hum of the old lights. He looked out the window at the fading sunset and thought of the gala, the laughter, the humiliation, and then Keanu's voice cutting through it all like light through fog. He smiled faintly to himself. Maybe his students were right. Maybe his story wasn't just about survival anymore. Maybe it was about being heard. Across the city, Keanu sat in his living room, scrolling through the same headlines. He wasn't smiling. He was thinking. The story was touching hearts, but he knew viral moments faded fast. What mattered was what came next. He reached for his phone and called Maria Sanders. "It's time we do something real," he said. Maria picked up on the first ring. "I was just about to call you," she said, her voice full of energy. "You've seen what's happening, right? It's everywhere." "I've seen it," Keanu replied. "And that's exactly why we can't let it stop here." She went quiet for a moment, understanding the weight in his tone. "You're thinking long term." "Exactly," Keanu said. "People are inspired now, but inspiration fades. If we want this moment to mean something, we need to build something from it. Something that honors what David stands for. Maria's excitement grew. A foundation? A scholarship? Maybe both, Keanu said. But it should carry his name, not mine. Maria smiled through the phone. He's going to fight you on that. I know, Keanu said, a faint laugh escaping. That's what makes him the right person for it. Across town, David sat at his kitchen table with a mug of tea, reading through dozens of emails from former students. They were messages of gratitude, stories of how his lessons had changed their lives. One student wrote, "You taught me to believe in myself when no one else did. Seeing you on that stage reminded me why I never gave up." David set the phone down, his eyes misting. He thought of the years he'd spent feeling unseen, the long nights grading papers, the times he wondered if his work even mattered. Now, the answer was shining back at him from every message. He didn't care about fame. What moved him was knowing that his voice, quiet and humble, had reached farther than he ever imagined. As he closed his laptop, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Maria. "Keanu and I want to meet tomorrow. He has an idea you should hear." David read it twice. He didn't know what to expect, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something new, hope mixed with purpose. He looked toward the dark window, where his reflection stared back, tired but alive. The world had finally listened. The next afternoon, Keanu met Maria at a small cafe tucked between two bookshops in downtown Los Angeles. It was the kind of quiet place where serious conversations could breathe. The noise of the city faded behind the glass, replaced by the soft hum of jazz and the clinking of mugs. Maria arrived first, her phone buzzing with notifications about the viral video. She smiled when she saw Keanu walk in, still wearing his simple black jacket, his demeanor calm, despite the chaos swirling online. "You've caused quite a movement," she said as he sat down. Keanu smiled faintly. "I didn't cause anything. The truth did." Maria leaned forward. "So, what now? You didn't call me here just to talk about views and headlines." He nodded. "No. I've been thinking about David, about what that night meant. We can't let it become another viral moment that fades in a week." Maria tilted her head. "You mean you want to keep it going?" "I want to honor him properly," Keanu said. "That man represents thousands of teachers who show up every day for kids who have nothing. He stood there with grace while people mocked him, and he still spoke about hope. That deserves something permanent." Maria's eyes softened. "What do you have in mind?" Keanu thought for a moment before answering. "A scholarship fund. Not for students, but for teachers. We'll call it the David Carter Dignity Fund. It'll support educators who work in low-income communities, give them grants for classroom supplies, mentorship programs, maybe even sabbaticals to help them recharge." Maria's expression lit up. "You'd really do that?" Keanu nodded. "It's not charity, it's justice." She leaned back, visibly moved. "That's powerful, Keanu. You're talking about changing the way people see teachers, turning them from background figures into the heroes they are." "That's the goal," he said. "Too many people think teaching is just a job. It's not. It's a calling, and they deserve to be treated like it." Maria smiled. "I can reach out to the education board, some unions, maybe a few nonprofit partners. They'll want to be part of this." "Do that," Keanu said, "and let's keep it quiet until we're ready. This shouldn't be about publicity, it should be about purpose." Outside, a group of college students walked by, pointing through the window as they recognized him. Keanu waved politely, then turned back to Maria. "The cameras can tell one story. Let's write a better one." Maria nodded. "Then let's build something that lasts." Over the next few weeks, the idea began to take shape. Keanu and Maria scheduled quiet meetings with education leaders, community organizers, and foundation directors. They didn't make grand announcements or stage press events. Every meeting started with the same words from Keanu. "This is about dignity, not publicity." They met first with Dr. Evelyn Rhodes, a veteran superintendent known for her work in underserved districts. She listened carefully, as Keanu explained his plan, the creation of a scholarship fund for teachers working in low-income communities. It wouldn't just hand out checks. It would provide real tools for change. Dr. Rhodes smiled as she scribbled notes. You'd be surprised how many teachers leave not because they lose passion, but because they can't afford to stay, she said. A fund like this could keep the best ones in the classroom, Maria added. And we'll include mentorship programs, pair experienced educators with new ones. The kind of guidance that builds confidence and longevity. Keanu nodded. I also want to create classroom support, grants money for supplies, technology, or even field trips. Simple things that make a huge difference. Dr. Rhodes leaned back, impressed. That's a rare way to look at it. Most people just focus on the students. Keanu smiled slightly. Without teachers, there are no students. Word spread quietly through the education community. And soon, teachers from across the state began volunteering ideas. Some offered to mentor others. A few even suggested naming small scholarships after their own late mentors. What began as a conversation was turning into a movement, one rooted not in celebrity power, but in shared purpose. Meanwhile, Keanu personally handled the funding. He didn't want sponsors dictating direction or attaching their names for recognition. The money will come from me, he told Maria. And if others want to help, they'll have to match that level of humility. Maria grinned. You're setting the bar high. Good, he said. That's how we keep it honest. When they finally drafted the program proposal, it carried the name the David Carter Dignity Fund across the top in bold letters. Below, it was a simple mission statement: to honor educators who lift others through integrity, perseverance, and compassion. Maria stared at the document for a long time before speaking. He's going to be overwhelmed when he sees this. Keanu looked thoughtful. He doesn't even know yet. They agreed to tell David in person. A week later, they met him at the same small community center where he tutored on weekends. David walked in wearing a faded blue sweater and carrying a stack of graded papers under his arm. When he saw Keanu and Maria waiting, he smiled, though curiosity flickered in his eyes. Is this about the video again? He asked. Because I told you both, I'm happy to fade back into normal life. Maria chuckled. You might want to hear him out first. Keanu handed him a folder. It's not about the video, David. It's about what it stood for. David opened it slowly. His eyes scanned the first page, his brow furrowing. The David Carter Dignity Fund? He looked up, stunned. You're naming something after me? Keanu's tone was gentle. We're naming it after what you represent. You stood for dignity when it mattered. Most. That deserves a legacy. David's voice caught in his throat. I don't deserve this. Keanu smiled faintly. You don't have to deserve it. You've already lived it. For a long moment, David said nothing. Then he whispered, You're not just honoring me. You're honoring every teacher who ever felt invisible. Keanu nodded. Exactly. David sat in silence, still holding the folder. The weight of what it represented pressed on him like something sacred. All his life, he had worked quietly, teaching kids who rarely received recognition. Now, somehow, his name was being used to help others just like him. He closed the folder slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. You could have called it anything, Keanu. Why my name? Keanu looked him in the eye. Because dignity deserves a legacy. What you showed that night, that kind of grace under fire, it reminded the world what real strength looks like. You didn't fight back with anger. You fought back with integrity. That's something worth carrying forward, Maria added softly. People saw a man stand tall when he had every reason to walk away. That moment gave hope to millions of teachers who've been made to feel small. David blinked back tears. You don't know what this means. For years, I've wondered if I was making any difference. Now, I see that maybe the lesson wasn't just for my students, it was for all of us. Keanu smiled. That's exactly right. This isn't about fame or charity. It's about honoring truth, about giving people the resources to keep doing what you've done your whole life. David set the folder down and extended his hand. then I'll help however I can. If it bears my name, it has to stay honest. It has to really serve the people it's meant to." Keanu shook his hand firmly. "That's why it's your name on it. Because you'll make sure it stays that way." Maria looked at them both, smiling through emotion. "You." "No," she said. "This is going to change lives. Not just for teachers, but for kids who'll finally have someone who can keep teaching without burning out." David laughed softly, still overwhelmed. "It feels strange. Yesterday, I was just trying to survive a speech. Today, this." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes the moments we least expect turn into the ones that define us." David nodded. "Then let's make it count." The three of them stood for a moment in quiet understanding. Outside, the sound of children playing drifted in from the park nearby. The air smelled faintly of chalk and cut grass, reminders of the world David had spent his life building. In that moment, he didn't feel humiliated anymore. He felt purpose returning, stronger than ever. Keanu glanced at the folder one last time and said quietly, "This isn't just a fund. It's a thank you to every teacher who never stopped showing up." David smiled. "Then let's make sure it never stops giving." The morning was ordinary at Jefferson High, a small public school tucked between cracked sidewalks and old storefronts in South Los Angeles. The bell had just rung, and the hallways buzzed with laughter and sneakers squeaking against linoleum floors. Inside room 204, David Carter stood by the whiteboard, writing out a math problem while his students settled in for class. He had no idea who was about to walk through the door. Outside, Keanu Reeves stood quietly at the school entrance, hands in his pockets, accompanied only by Maria Sanders. He wore his usual simplicity jeans, a black shirt, no security, no camera crew. He had insisted on coming unannounced. He didn't want fanfare. He wanted truth, the kind he saw in David's classroom that night when the man spoke about his students. The front desk receptionist almost dropped her coffee when he walked in. "Mr. Reeves?" she stammered. He smiled kindly. "Hi, I'm here to visit a friend, David Carter." Within minutes, the news spread through the halls like wildfire. Students peeked out of classroom doors, whispering and gasping. By the time Keanu reached room 204, a few brave kids were already waiting outside, pretending to drink from the water fountain just to catch a glimpse. David turned at the sound of quiet knocking. When he saw Keanu standing there, he froze mid-sentence. The students erupted into whispers. "Is that? No way! Mr. C knows Keanu Reeves?" Keanu smiled as he stepped into the classroom. "Hey, Mr. C," he said warmly. David blinked, then managed to laugh. "You really came." "I told you I would," Keanu said. "I wanted to see where the magic happens." The students giggled. One boy in the back whispered loudly, "This is the best day of my life." David motioned for him to come in fully. "All right, everyone, settle down. This is a surprise guest." Keanu grinned. "You can relax. I'm just here to learn." He walked among the desks, greeting students one by one. They were wide-eyed but respectful, some clutching their notebooks like souvenirs. He stopped beside a girl who was struggling with her math worksheet. "Can I try?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded shyly. Keanu crouched beside her desk, looked at the problem, and chuckled. "Oh no, this looks dangerous. Fractions were always my enemy." The class laughed. David leaned against his desk, watching the room light up in a way he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just excitement, it was joy mixed with pride. Keanu scribbled a wrong answer on purpose. "See? You're better at this than I am," he said, handing her the pencil. The girl laughed and corrected him instantly. "Good," he said with a grin. "You'll be teaching me next time." The moment felt light, but beneath it ran something deeper, a shared understanding between the man who stood for dignity and the one who lived it every day. The classroom buzzed with excitement, but it wasn't the kind of chaos that came from disruption. It was joy, pure and unfiltered, spilling into every corner of the room. Keanu moved easily among the students, crouching beside desks, asking questions, and laughing with them as if he'd been part of their world all along. He sat at a group table where 3 students were working on a history project about the civil rights movement. Their poster boards were covered with photos of marches, quotes from Martin Luther King Jr., and drawings of raised fists. One boy pointed shyly at his half-finished section and said, "I'm writing about ordinary people who did brave things." Keanu smiled. "That's a good topic. You know what's funny? I think your teacher fits right into that category." The kids laughed, and David shook his head from the front of the room, embarrassed. "Don't listen to him," he said, trying to keep the focus on their lesson. Keanu grinned. "Sorry, Mr. C, but it's true." He leaned closer to the group. You know, bravery doesn't always mean loud or famous. Sometimes it means showing up every day when nobody's watching, just to make sure someone else has a chance." The students listened quietly, their young faces thoughtful. For a moment, even the usual noise of pencils and chatter fell still. When class ended, the students swarmed around Keanu with questions, some about movies, but most about life. "Do you really believe people can change?" one asked. "What makes you want to help?" asked another. Keanu answered each question patiently, never rushing. "Yeah, people can change," he said. "But they need someone to believe they can first. That's what teachers like yours do every day." Before leaving, he posed for a single photo with the class. David agreed reluctantly, only because the students begged him. The moment captured them all, smiling Keanu in the middle, surrounded by kids with notebooks and markers in hand. No red carpets, no suits, no staged lighting, just sunlight pouring through cracked windows and a feeling of something real. Afterward, David and Keanu walked the hallway together. Murals painted by students lined the walls, bright with color, and slogans about hope, kindness, and equality. Keanu stopped in front of one mural that read, "We rise by lifting others." He studied it for a moment. "That's the entire reason for what we're doing, isn't it?" he said softly. David nodded. "These kids painted that last year after one of our classmates lost his mom. They wanted to remind everyone that lifting others is how you heal." Keanu's eyes softened. "That's incredible." They stepped into the teacher's lounge next, where a few staff members stood frozen, unsure whether to approach him. He broke the ice with his quiet humor. "Don't worry," he said, smiling. "I'm not here to observe anyone's lesson plans." The teachers laughed. One of them, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, said, "We just wanted to thank you for what you said that night. You spoke for all of us." Keanu shook his head gently. "No, David did. I just made sure people listened." The woman's eyes glistened. "You reminded the world that this job still matters." He looked around the room, taking in the coffee-stained counters, the stacks of ungraded papers, and the posters peeling off the walls. "This job doesn't just matter," he said quietly. "It's sacred." As they left the school, the students waved from the windows, calling his name. Keanu looked back one last time at the building, at the art, at the laughter that refused to be broken. He turned to David and said softly, "You're doing holy work here." It was 3 weeks after Keanu's visit to Jefferson High when their paths crossed again. The setting couldn't have been more different. A charity art auction downtown, filled with polished marble floors, designer gowns, and soft music. Keanu had attended quietly, as he often did, supporting a local foundation for youth art programs. He was talking with a curator about the scholarship fund when a familiar voice broke through the hum of conversation. "Mr. Reeves," the voice said cautiously. Keanu turned, recognizing Langford immediately. The man who had mocked David Carter now stood only a few feet away, looking entirely different from that night at the gala. His sharp confidence had melted into a posture of unease. He held a glass of water, not champagne. His suit was still expensive, but his demeanor wasn't. "Mr. Langford," Keanu greeted calmly. Langford shifted his weight, searching for the right words. I wasn't sure you'd talk to me." "I'll always talk to someone who wants to listen," Keanu said evenly. Langford nodded, his eyes flicking away. "I made a fool of myself that night. I've replayed it more times than I can count. Watching the video afterward, hearing what people said. I deserved every bit of it." Keanu folded his arms, his gaze steady but not harsh. "You didn't just insult a man," he said quietly. "You insulted everyone who's ever worked hard without being seen." Langford's jaw tightened as the words landed. "I know," he admitted. "I was trying to impress people. I thought I was being clever, funny. Turns out, I was just cruel." The honesty in his tone surprised Keanu. He didn't sense defensiveness, only shame. "Cruelty, disguised as humor, is still cruelty," Keanu said. Langford nodded again, his voice lower now. "That's the line that's haunted me. You said that night that mocking someone reveals your own poverty of spirit. I didn't get it then, but now I do." He swallowed hard before continuing. "After the gala, my daughter saw the video online. She's in college, studying to be a teacher. She called me crying. She said, 'Dad, how could you?' That's when it hit me. What I'd done wasn't just embarrassing. It was wrong." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the auction carried softly in the distance, but between them was only stillness. Keanu finally said, "We all fail sometimes. The question is what we do after." Langford looked down, his voice quiet. "I've started donating anonymously to schools. Nothing big yet, but it's a start. I also met with a principal in East LA to see how I can help directly. I needed that wake-up call." Keanu studied him, searching his expression for truth. What he saw wasn't guilt for the sake of appearance, it was humility. "Redemption starts with humility," Keanu said softly. Langford nodded slowly. "Then I hope this is a start." Keanu extended his hand. "It is." Langford hesitated, then shook it firmly. The handshake was brief, but sincere, the kind that said more than apologies ever could. Langford let out a long breath after the handshake, as though releasing weeks of guilt he had carried alone. "You know," he said, quietly, "I used to think giving money was enough. Write a check, attend an event, make a speech. It made me feel generous. But that night, watching you stand beside him, I realized I'd never actually respected the people I claimed to help." Keanu listened without interrupting. He'd seen this before, people who lived their whole lives mistaking status for compassion. But hearing Langford's honesty now, he felt something shift. This wasn't performative, it was real. Langford continued, "My father built wealth from nothing. He was a machinist before he started his company. He worked his hands raw for years. I thought I honored him by becoming successful. But when I laughed at that teacher, I realized I'd forgotten the kind of man my father really was." Keanu nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's not too late to honor him properly." Langford looked up. "How?" "By doing what your father did," Keanu said. "By working, but not for yourself, for others. You can't undo that night, but you can turn it into something better." Langford's expression softened. "I've been thinking about that. I spoke to the superintendent from Jefferson High, the same district where David teaches. I told her I wanted to cover the cost of fixing their broken heating systems. She didn't believe me at first." Keanu smiled faintly. "I imagine most people wouldn't. She cried when I told her it was real," Langford said, his voice breaking slightly. "It was the first time I'd done something that didn't have my name attached. It felt different. It felt right." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then keep doing it that way. The quiet kind of good lasts longer." Langford nodded, wiping his eyes quickly, embarrassed by his emotion. "You know, I used to think men like me and men like him, David, lived in different worlds, but maybe we're supposed to meet in the middle. Maybe that's where change begins," Keanu said. "In the middle ground, between pride and empathy." They stood there for a few seconds longer, before Langford finally said, "Tell him I'm sorry. Not because the world saw what I did, but because he didn't deserve it." "I think he already knows," Keanu said gently. "The way you live now will say it louder than words ever could." Langford nodded one final time. "Thank you for not walking away that night. You could have ignored it." Keanu looked him in the eye. "Sometimes silence is betrayal. You faced yours, and that's what matters now." Langford extended his hand once more, but this time, His grip was firm and steady. "Maybe one day I can stand for something decent too." "You already started," Keanu said. As Langford turned to leave, the weight in the air seemed lighter, the tension finally gone. Keanu watched him disappear into the crowd, a humbled man who had learned the hardest lesson of all, that redemption doesn't come from applause, but from action. Later that night, driving home along the quiet streets of Los Angeles, Keanu thought about what had happened. Change, he realized, never sweeps through the world in one grand gesture. It starts one heart at a time, one conscience at a time, and sometimes all it takes is one moment of courage to start the chain reaction. The ballroom looked almost unrecognizable. The same crystal chandeliers hung overhead, but the light felt softer now. The same polished floors gleamed, yet tonight they reflected something entirely different. Gone were the stiff tuxedos, the forced smiles, and the self-congratulating air of wealth. In their place were teachers in modest suits, students in simple dresses, and families who'd driven hours just to witness the beginning of something new. It was the official launch of the Carter Dignity Scholarship Fund. The same hall where David Carter had once stood humiliated before a room full of laughter now glowed with genuine warmth. Every seat was taken. The stage was decorated with student artwork donated by schools from across Los Angeles, drawings of classrooms, books, and hands reaching upward toward the words painted above the podium. "Dignity is the root of every dream." Maria Sanders stood near the entrance, greeting guests with her usual grace. She watched as teachers from across the state arrived, some from small desert towns, others from crowded inner-city schools. They came not for glamour, but because they believed in what this night represented. When David entered, the room erupted into applause. It was immediate and sincere. People stood, smiling, clapping for the man whose quiet endurance had sparked something greater than himself. David stopped at the doorway, overwhelmed, his eyes glistening as he looked around. Keanu walked up beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Feels different this time, doesn't it?" David exhaled shakily. "Completely." Together, they walked toward the front. Cameras flashed again, but not with mockery, this time with respect. The audience wasn't here to be entertained. They were here to honor the spirit of teaching, the dignity of work, and the belief that one person's courage could transform many. As the ceremony began, Maria took the stage first. "A few months ago," she said into the microphone, "this room held a moment of cruelty that was seen by millions, but it also held a moment of courage that inspired millions more. Tonight, we return not to erase what happened, but to redeem it." The audience erupted in applause. She continued, "The Carter Dignity Fund will provide grants, mentorships, and resources to teachers who serve in our most underfunded schools. Because as David once said, every child deserves a chance, even if the world doesn't see them." He hesitated for just a second, gripping the podium as if to steady his heart. "Last time I stood here," David began, his voice trembling, "I almost walked away. The room went completely still. But thanks to someone's courage," he continued, glancing toward Keanu, "I stayed. And because I stayed, I witnessed what happens when grace meets truth." He paused, scanning the crowd. Teachers nodded, some wiping tears. "Tonight isn't about me," he said softly. "It's about every teacher who refuses to give up, every student who keeps showing up, and every hand that chooses to lift another instead of point down." The audience rose to its feet, the sound of applause swelling like a wave. The applause thundered through the hall, echoing off the crystal and marble like an anthem of redemption. David stood motionless for a moment, overwhelmed by the sound. The last time he had stood on that stage, the laughter had cut through him like a knife. Now, those same echoes carried only respect. He waited until the clapping softened, then continued, his voice steadier now. "When I started teaching, I never imagined a night like this. Most of us don't do it for recognition. We do it because someone once believed in us, and we want to return the favor. Tonight, this fund isn't just a tribute, it's a promise that no teacher will ever feel invisible again." crowd responded with a standing ovation. Teachers called out, "Amen," and "That's right," from the audience. David smiled, his humility shining even in the bright lights. He gestured toward the artwork behind him. "These drawings," he said, "were made by students from the very schools this fund will serve." They wanted to remind us that what happens inside a classroom changes everything outside it. So if you ever doubt that your work matters, remember, their hands painted these walls. He took a deep breath. "And to the man who reminded me of my own worth when I'd forgotten it, thank you." He turned slightly, looking at Keanu, who stood off stage with his hands folded in quiet pride. The room turned their gaze toward him as David continued. "He showed us that dignity isn't given by wealth or titles. It's earned by how we treat others. And tonight, he's turned one act of kindness into a legacy." Maria signaled for Keanu to join him. The audience rose again as he walked onto the stage, smiling warmly. When he reached David, they shook hands, the same gesture that had once been shared backstage on the night of Humiliation. But this time, it wasn't about comfort, it was about solidarity. Keanu took the microphone but paused for a moment before speaking. "I didn't come here to be thanked," he said softly. "I came to thank you. All of you who teach, who build, who show up when the world looks away. You are the ones who shape everything that matters." He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of dozens of teachers who had spent their lives giving quietly. David said something once that stuck with me. He said someone stayed for him, and because of that, he stayed for others. I think that's what this is all about. Staying when it's hard. Believing when it feels hopeless. Choosing kindness when the world rewards cruelty. The room was utterly silent, every word sinking in like truth they'd been waiting to hear. Then Keanu smiled faintly. "I don't think of this as a scholarship. I think of it as a thank you letter to teachers everywhere. You've been holding the world together, quietly, one student at a time. It's time someone held you up too." The applause was deafening. Cameras flashed again, but this time the moment didn't belong to fame, it belonged to purpose. David turned to Keanu, his voice low but full of gratitude. "You didn't just change my life," he said. "You changed how people see what we do." Keanu shook his head. "You changed it. I just helped them look." And as they stood together beneath the glow of the lights, the hall that once witnessed humiliation now stood as a monument to grace. When the last guests had left the ballroom and the lights began to dim, David lingered near the stage. The banners were still hanging, the chairs half stacked, and the echoes of applause still seemed to float in the air. It felt surreal to him how the same room that once made him feel invisible now carried the sound of hope. He walked slowly toward the podium, where a few stray programs were left behind. Someone had placed a single white rose on it, its petals still fresh. He smiled faintly, thinking of his students and how they always found small ways to remind him of what mattered. As he reached into his pocket to put away his glasses, he felt something unusual, a folded envelope, soft from being handled. He pulled it out and saw his name written in neat, looping handwriting, Mr. C. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he opened it carefully, unfolding the lined paper inside. The handwriting was small, but the first words stopped him cold. "Dear Mr. C, I watched the video of you at that fancy gala. You looked nervous, but you didn't quit. You kept standing there even when people were laughing. I thought about that a lot. You always tell us that people's opinions don't decide our worth. I finally get what you meant." David felt his throat tighten. He continued reading, his hands trembling slightly. "You taught me that even when people don't believe in you, you keep teaching, because someone always needs you. You taught me that kindness isn't weakness, it's strength. You taught me that being brave doesn't mean being loud, it means showing up anyway." He paused, blinking back tears. "One day, I want to be a teacher like you. I want to be the kind of person who stays. Thank you for not walking away that night. You showed me what dignity really looks like." The letter was signed simply, "Love, Janelle." David sat down in one of the empty chairs, holding the paper tightly. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. In all his years of teaching, through all the awards and certificates and polite acknowledgments, nothing had ever struck him like this. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and whispered softly, "That's it. That's the reason." The exhaustion of the evening faded away, replaced by a quiet warmth that settled deep in his chest. The letter was more than gratitude. It was proof that what he did mattered, that even when he doubted himself, the lessons had reached someone. He folded the letter gently, placing it back in his pocket. "Thank you, Janelle," he whispered. "You have no idea how much this means." The night air outside the ballroom was cool and still. David stepped out onto the quiet street, holding his coat closed against the breeze. The city lights shimmered off wet pavement, but his thoughts were far away back in his classroom, back to the faces of the students who gave his life meaning. He reached into his pocket again, feeling the folded paper. It was small, but it carried more weight than anything he'd ever received. When he got home, the house was dark, except for a lamp in the living room. Angela was waiting on the couch, half asleep with a cup of tea beside her. She stirred when he came in, smiling gently. "You stayed late," she said, softly. He nodded. "I needed a minute." She studied him for a moment. "How was it?" David sat down beside her and handed her the letter. "This," he said simply. Angela unfolded the paper and began reading. As she reached the final line, her eyes filled with tears. "Oh, David," she whispered. "She wants to be a teacher." He smiled faintly. "I know. And that's the real scholarship, isn't it? Not the money, not the stage, just one heart passing something on to another." Angela reached for his hand, squeezing it. "You've spent your life planting seeds. Tonight, you got to see one bloom." They sat quietly for a while, the house filled with a soft kind of peace. Later that night, before bed, David took out his phone and snapped a picture of the letter. He sent it to Keanu with a short message. "This is the real scholarship, one heart at a time." It didn't take long for the reply to come. "That's the legacy," Keanu wrote. David smiled at the screen. There were no grand speeches, no headlines left to chase just two men who understood that true change starts small. The next morning, he framed Janelle's letter and placed it on his classroom wall. His students noticed it right away. "What's that, Mr. C?" one of them asked. He smiled. "A reminder," he said, "that what you do today can echo a lot farther than you think." Janelle blushed in her seat, but said nothing. She didn't have to. The look in her eyes said everything. Weeks later, as spring arrived, the scholarship fund began awarding its first grants. Teachers from across the country applied, some for classroom equipment, others for mentorship programs or counseling support. The applications poured in faster than anyone expected. Maria called David one afternoon, her voice full of emotion. "We've already helped 30 teachers in the first month. You should see the letters coming in, they're incredible." David smiled. Then, "It's working." "It's more than working," Maria said. "It's spreading." He looked at the framed letter on his wall, sunlight catching the edge of the glass. "That's how change moves," he said softly. "One student, one classroom, one teacher at a time." That evening, he walked the halls of Jefferson High long after the final bell. The building was quiet, except for the faint hum of lights and the rustle of papers. As he passed each classroom, he thought of every teacher still inside, grading late, giving one more ounce of care the world might never see. He smiled to himself, whispering the words that had come to define his life. Stay for them. Always stay. And somewhere, in a notebook waiting to be opened, another letter was already being written, because legacies like his never really end. It began quietly, as all genuine things do. A small local newspaper ran a story titled, "From Humiliation to Honor, a Teacher's Redemption Inspires a Nation." The article detailed how David Carter's moment of grace, once a symbol of cruelty, had transformed into the foundation of a nationwide movement. Within days, the story was picked up by larger outlets. Morning shows replayed clips of the scholarship launch, focusing not on celebrity but on compassion. Across the country, teachers who had once felt forgotten began sharing their own stories online, small victories from classrooms that never made the news. One teacher in Chicago wrote, "Mr. Carter gave us our voice back." Another in Texas said, "Because of the Dignity Fund, my students finally have books that aren't falling apart." Everywhere, people were talking about the quiet power of teaching. Hashtags like #Dignity Fund and #Stand for Teachers began trending, not because of marketing, but because people were moved. Reporters called Keanu's team endlessly, requesting interviews, television appearances, photo spreads. Each time, the answer was the same. "He appreciates your interest," Maria would tell them, "but he wants the story to belong to the teachers." When one national talk show host called personally, Keanu answered himself. "Thank you," he said kindly, "but I think the people you should invite are the ones standing in front of chalkboards every day. They're the real story." "You'd really turn down airtime for that?" Keanu chuckled. "It's not my airtime to take." Word of his humility spread as quickly as the story itself. Commentators began calling it quiet heroism. The phrase stuck, appearing in headlines, essays, and even academic journals discussing the impact of social empathy in modern culture. But for Keanu, it wasn't theory. It was simple truth. Meanwhile, David continued his routine, still teaching at Jefferson High, still walking the same hallways every morning. But everything felt different. His classroom was now a symbol of what hope could do when it refused to back down. Teachers visited from other cities, asking how to apply for the fund. His students took pride in saying, "That's our teacher. That's Mr. C." Janelle, the student who wrote him the letter, began volunteering with Maria after school, helping manage the growing flood of scholarship applications. She told David one day, "I want to be part of what you started." He smiled. "You already are." Donations poured in. Corporations, private donors, and former students all wanted to contribute. But Keanu remained firm about one rule: no corporate branding, no sponsorship banners. "The moment this becomes about image," he told Maria, "it loses its soul." She agreed. And that's what makes it pure. Even Langford, once the symbol of arrogance, found his own quiet path to redemption. He donated the funds to build a community library in South Los Angeles, naming it after his late father. When reporters asked him why, he said simply, "Because it's time to put something good in the world instead of noise." The transformation didn't need press releases. It didn't need a campaign. It just spread like light through cracks in darkness. By spring, what began as a moment of humiliation had become a national reminder that dignity, once ignited, was unstoppable. By early summer, the Carter Dignity Fund had reached every corner of the country. Letters poured in from small towns, big cities, and rural schools no one had ever heard of. A teacher in Montana wrote about using her grant to start a breakfast program for students who came to class hungry. A retired educator in Georgia used her funds to train young teachers in emotional resilience. Every story was different, but they all shared the same heartbeat: kindness reborn through action. Maria's office, once a modest nonprofit workspace, had transformed into a hub of compassion. Boxes of letters filled the walls, handwritten notes from teachers, students, and parents who wanted to thank the man whose story had reignited their faith in education. Volunteers sorted through stacks of envelopes daily, reading each one aloud, often pausing to wipe away tears. "Listen to this one," Maria told Keanu during a late-night call. A teacher from Ohio said, "I was about to quit, but then I saw that man stand tall on stage, and I realized we all needed to keep standing. Thank you for reminding us that our work has worth." Keanu was silent for a moment, then said softly, "That's David's victory, not mine." Maria smiled on the other end. Then maybe that's what real leadership looks like. In Los Angeles, Jefferson High began seeing visitors from around the world: teachers, journalists, and even students who just wanted to see the classroom that had started it all. David welcomed them kindly, always saying the same thing: "It wasn't me, it was all of us who refused to give up." But behind the humility, he couldn't hide how deeply moved he was. He watched the once fading walls of his school become vibrant again. Volunteers repainted the hallways. New supplies arrived weekly, and the small library began filling with books donated from all over the country. The real miracle, however, wasn't the money, it was the change in attitude. Teachers who had once felt defeated began smiling again. Students took pride in their school. Parents started volunteering after hours. It wasn't charity anymore. It was community. Keanu visited quietly one morning, slipping into David's classroom unannounced, just as he had before. The students greeted him like an old friend. He stayed only long enough to watch one of them read a short essay titled, "Dignity Doesn't Shout." The piece ended with the words, "It just keeps showing up, even when no one notices." When class ended, Keanu turned to David and said, "You realize you've built something that doesn't need headlines now. It runs on its own." David nodded, his eyes warm. "That's how you know it's real." As summer went on, more donors followed Keanu's example. Instead of flashy galas, they started giving quietly, funding small teacher housing programs, after-school art clubs, and mentorship networks. The movement had taken on a life of its own, fueled not by fame, but by the simple truth that decency inspires decency. Even Langford's library became a local symbol of renewal. Children crowded its small reading rooms every weekend, and families began holding community meetings there. On the front wall hung a simple brass plaque that read, "Knowledge belongs to everyone." No one made speeches about it. No one sought credit. The story of one teacher and one act of courage had rippled outward, touching lives in ways none of them could have predicted. And through it all, one message stood tall: dignity is contagious. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Jefferson High, flooding room 204 with soft golden light. The laughter of students echoed down the hallway, mingling with the sound of chalk against the board. It was an ordinary day, but for David Carter, it felt like a quiet miracle. 1 year had passed since the launch of the Carter Dignity Scholarship Fund. In that time, the school had changed in ways that went far beyond paint and polish. The walls gleamed with fresh color, the floor shone from recent repair, and every desk in the room was brand new. There were sleek laptops on the tables now, donated through the fund. The children who once shared torn textbooks now worked confidently on glowing screens, their energy bright and focused. As David looked around his classroom, a smile tugged at his lips. He had always believed in these kids, even when the world didn't. But now, for the first time, he felt the world believed too. A knock sounded on the door. He turned, expecting one of the volunteers from the district. Instead, standing in the doorway, wearing his familiar black jacket and easy smile, was Keanu Reeves. The students gasped. "Good morning, class," Keanu said, his tone calm and kind. "I hope I'm not interrupting." David grinned. "You're right on time." He crossed the room quickly and shook Keanu's hand. The students whispered excitedly among themselves. "That's him," one of them said under their breath. "That's the guy from the video." Keanu laughed softly. "Don't worry. Today, I'm the student." David gestured toward the classroom. "Then, welcome to the future you helped build." Keanu looked around slowly, taking in the details. The new desks gleamed under the morning light. The walls were lined with student art paintings of teachers and students together, each with words like respect, hope, and dignity painted above them. The old cracked clock above the whiteboard had been replaced with a digital one. But what struck him most wasn't the equipment, it was the joy. The room felt alive. "You've done amazing work here," Keanu said quietly. David shook his head. "Your scholarship changed lives, Keanu." Keanu smiled gently. "No, you did." They shared a quiet look of understanding. Around them, the students waited curiously, sensing that something important was happening, even if they couldn't quite name it. Janelle, now a confident sophomore, raised her hand. "Mr. C, can I read my essay?" she asked. David nodded. "Go ahead, Janelle." She stood, holding a small paper in her hands. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but grew stronger with each word. "It's called The Man Who Never Gave Up," she began. The class fell silent. Janelle took a steady breath, then began to read. There are people who build towers and monuments so the world will remember their names. But there are others who build something greater people. My teacher, Mr. Carter, is one of them. Her classmates listened, spellbound. Even the ones who usually fidgeted sat still, their eyes locked on her. When I first joined his class, she continued, I didn't believe in myself. I thought kids like me didn't get to dream big. But Mr. C never let us talk down about ourselves. He said we had voices that mattered, and he made us prove it. He told us that respect starts when you respect yourself. Keanu watched from the back of the room, his arms folded loosely. The words coming from that young girl carried more weight than any speech he had ever heard. Janelle went on, her tone strengthening. Last year, I saw a video that made me cry. I saw my teacher standing on a stage, while people laughed at him, and I saw someone stand beside him not to protect his pride, but to protect his dignity. That moment changed more than his life. It changed mine too. The classroom was so silent that the hum of the air conditioner felt like a heartbeat. He taught me that being kind doesn't mean being weak, she said, her eyes shining. It means having the courage to do the right thing, even when nobody's watching. He taught me that we don't need to be famous to make a difference. We just need to care enough to stay. Her final words came out softly, almost as a whisper. He's the man who never gave up on his students, on his work, or on himself. And because of him, one day, I'll be a teacher too. When she finished, the classroom erupted in applause. Some of the students were clapping through tears. David stood frozen, emotion tightening his chest. He tried to speak, but no words came. He just looked at Janelle, his eyes full of pride. Keanu stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. That was beautiful, he said quietly. You remind me of why this all started. Janelle smiled through tears. Thank you for believing in my teacher. Keanu nodded. He made it easy. The class laughed softly, and the tension broke. David cleared his throat. All right, everyone, let's thank Janelle again, and then let's give our guest a proper Jefferson High welcome. The students cheered, some calling out questions, others asking if Keanu could sign their notebooks. He smiled, moving from desk to desk, shaking hands, listening to their dreams. One student said he wanted to design airplanes. Another said she wanted to open a bakery. Janelle, shy but proud, said she wanted to teach in the same district someday. Keanu listened to every word, as if it mattered, because to him, it did. Before leaving, he turned to David one last time. The two men stood at the front of the class, the same place where David had once struggled to believe in himself. Keanu looked around at the room filled with laughter and light. You know, he said softly, a year ago, I saw a man get humiliated for telling the truth. Now I see that same man surrounded by students who see him as a hero. That's what respect can build when courage meets kindness. David smiled. And that's what happens when someone chooses to stand beside you instead of above you. Keanu reached out and shook his hand. Keep teaching. The world still needs you. David nodded, his voice steady but emotional. And it still needs people who believe in teachers. As Keanu left the classroom, the students rushed to the windows to wave. He turned once more, lifting a hand in return. For a moment, he stood there, watching them, the next generation of dreamers, shaped by a man who never gave up. The same man who once walked off that stage in shame now stood as a symbol of honor. And in the hum of that small classroom in South Los Angeles, dignity had found its home. The chandeliers sparkled above the grand ballroom once again, but the air carried an entirely different energy this time. Gone was the cold glitter of elitism, replaced by warmth, laughter, and quiet pride. A banner stretched across the stage, reading, "The Carter Dignity Scholarship Gala celebrating those who stay." It had been exactly 1 year since that unforgettable night when laughter had filled this very room for all the wrong reasons. Now, the same hall had become a monument to redemption. Tables were filled with teachers, students, donors, and families whose lives had been touched by the fund. There were no lavish decorations, no extravagant centerpieces, just small candles flickering beside handwritten notes from students thanking their teachers. David Carter sat near the front, dressed in his best Navy suit. He looked around, marveling at how familiar yet unrecognizable the place felt. The same chandeliers, the same stage, even some of the same guests, but everything else had changed. Maria approached him, radiant in a simple black dress. "Ready for your moment, Mr. Guest of Honor?" she teased. David smiled, shaking his head. "I thought those words were only for people in movies." "You earned them," she said. "Every one of them." Across the room, Keanu was speaking quietly with reporters who had come to cover the evening. They had begged him for interviews, but he repeated what had become his mantra. "This story isn't mine. It belongs to the teachers." As the lights dimmed, the host stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, we honor the people who shape lives in ways no spotlight ever could. Please welcome the man whose courage turned humiliation into hope, Mr. David Carter." The applause that followed shook the room. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering as David stood. His heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with gratitude. He took a slow breath, then walked toward the stage, the same path he had taken a year before, but now with his head held high. When he reached the podium, he paused for a moment, looking out over the sea of faces. The sight filled him with emotion. Teachers, students, even some of the donors from the old Gala, all standing together. "A year ago," he began, "I stood on this same stage for a very different reason. Back then, I thought dignity was something people could take away from you with words. But I learned that night that dignity isn't something you're given or something that can be taken. It's something you live." The room fell silent. Every word carried the weight of lived truth. He continued, "That night, a man stood up for me when I couldn't find the strength to stand for myself. He reminded me that kindness is not weakness, and humility is not silence. It's power, the kind that changes hearts, one at a time." He glanced toward Keanu, who sat near the front table, listening with quiet pride. "Tonight," David said, smiling, "we're not here to remember what happened, but to celebrate what became of it." The applause grew again, filling the hall with light and sound. David waited for the applause to quiet, his hands resting on the edges of the podium. His voice steadied as he continued, "When I walked off this stage last year, I thought that moment would follow me forever. I thought people would only remember the laughter. But what I've learned since then is that the sound of mockery fades. The sound of kindness echoes." He smiled, scanning the faces in the audience. "I've seen classrooms rebuilt, teachers finding hope again, students discovering their worth. I've seen what happens when dignity becomes more than a word. It becomes a movement. Tonight, that movement belongs to every teacher who stayed when it would have been easier to quit." From one of the back tables, Langford sat quietly, hands clasped in his lap. His posture was humble, his expression thoughtful. When David's eyes met his, Langford gave a small nod, an unspoken apology that had already turned into action. David went on, "I once thought the world didn't see us. The teachers who buy their own supplies, the ones who skip lunch to tutor a student, the ones who keep believing in kids when others stop trying. But now I know the truth, we were seen. We just needed someone to remind us to look up." He paused, then smiled toward Maria and Keanu. "Someone once told me that redemption begins with humility. That same person showed me that courage isn't about shouting louder, it's about standing taller. So tonight, I'd like to ask him to join me on stage." The audience turned as Keanu rose from his seat. The applause swelled again, waves of admiration following him as he made his way to the front. He walked with his familiar calmness, giving a few small nods to the crowd before joining David at the podium. David turned to him and said softly, "You gave me back my voice. Now, let's use it to give others theirs." Keanu smiled and leaned toward the microphone. "David's being generous," he said. But the truth is, all I did was listen. This man and every teacher in this room showed me what real heroism looks like. It's the kind that doesn't need cameras or applause. It just keeps showing up." The audience fell silent, hanging on every word. Keanu continued, "When we started the Carter Dignity Fund, we hoped to make a difference in a few schools. But tonight, we're proud to announce that it's growing nationwide. Starting this year, the fund will expand to all 50 states, supporting educators and classrooms that need it most." The room erupted. Teachers rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even wiping away tears. Cameras flashed, but for once, no one cared about publicity. It wasn't a spectacle, it was a celebration. Keanu stepped back, letting David take the final word. David's voice wavered slightly as he said, "This isn't about me, or about one night. It's about every child waiting for someone to believe in them. It's about every teacher fighting battles no one sees. And it's about the truth that no act of kindness ever dies. It just finds new hands to carry it forward." The applause began again, louder than ever. Langford stood with the rest of the audience, clapping until his palms stung. Maria wiped her eyes. Even the event staff along the back wall joined in. Keanu turned to David, smiling. A year ago they laughed. Tonight, they stand. David nodded, emotion thick in his throat. That's what dignity does. It rises. The two men stood side by side as the crowd continued to applaud, the sound swelling until it filled the entire hall. The same chandeliers that once glittered coldly now shimmered with warmth, reflecting the light of 1,000 hopeful faces. And as the music began and the audience rose to its feet, the ballroom transformed into something sacred, not a monument to wealth or fame, but to humanity itself. The afternoon sun drifted low over the rooftops of South Los Angeles, casting a golden haze across the quiet neighborhood. The schoolyard at Jefferson High glowed in that soft light, the sound of children's laughter rising and falling like music carried on the wind. Their sneakers thudded against the pavement, the swings creaked gently, and somewhere a whistle blew, calling them back from recess. Keanu stood at the edge of the playground, watching. He wore no suit, no sunglasses, nothing that set him apart. Just a man in a simple jacket, hands in his pockets, eyes taking in the joy of a place reborn. The last time he had seen this yard, it had been worn and faded grass patchy, benches broken, laughter rare. Now, the colors seemed brighter. The walls shimmered with fresh murals painted by students, words like respect, hope, and dignity framed in bold colors. Not far from the basketball court, David sat, beneath a tree grading papers. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and the late light danced on his hair. From a distance, Keanu could hear him chuckle softly, as one of the students called out a playful goodbye. There was a peaceful rhythm in the scene. Simple, human, complete. Keanu walked over slowly, stopping beside him. David looked up, surprised but smiling. "You never call ahead, do you?" Keanu smiled back. "Some things are better seen without introductions." David gestured to the papers in his lap. "End of the semester. Same work, same long nights, but now I get to do it with a full heart." Keanu nodded, glancing toward the children still laughing nearby. "You built something beautiful here, David." David shook his head. "We built it. Together." They watched the sunset settle deeper into orange, the playground slowly emptying as parents arrived to pick up their kids. A flock of birds crossed the sky, flying in perfect formation. After a moment, Keanu said quietly, "It's strange, isn't it? How one small act can ripple this far." David smiled. "You mean your act?" Keanu shook his head. "No, yours. You stood there and spoke truth, even when the room didn't deserve to hear it. I just made sure they listened." The words hung gently between them. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of understanding. The air cooled as the sun slipped lower, painting long shadows across the grass. The golden hours settled over the school, the light soft and forgiving. Keanu and David continued to sit in quiet conversation as the last of the children left, their laughter fading into the distance. David leaned back against the tree and said softly, "I used to think this place would never change, that no matter how hard we worked, we'd always be forgotten. But now I look around, and it feels like the world finally caught up to what we already knew, that our kids deserve more than leftovers." Keanu nodded. "It's not that the world didn't care," he said gently. "It's that sometimes it needs a reminder of what matters." He looked out across the playground, where a group of volunteers were stacking soccer balls and locking up the field gate. "You gave them that reminder," David chuckled. "You make it sound easy." "Nothing worth doing ever is," Keanu replied. "But you did it anyway." The wind rustled through the leaves above them, scattering a few across David's lap. He brushed them aside, then picked up the last essay from his stack. "You know, every time I grade papers now, I think about what that night taught me. Dignity isn't about who notices your work. It's about doing it right even when no one does." Keanu smiled. "That's what makes you a teacher and a hero." David shook his head. "If I'm a hero, it's only because you stood beside me when I was ready to walk away." Keanu looked at him, the faintest trace of emotion in his eyes. "Sometimes, standing up for someone once is enough to change everything." They both fell silent again, watching the last rays of the sun wash the school in amber light. For a long while, neither spoke. The moment didn't need words. After a while, David said quietly, "You ever think about that night? About how one cruel laugh could have erased 20 years of work?" Keanu nodded slowly. "I do. But I think about what came after more, the moment you stood back up. That's what people remember now. Not the cruelty, the courage." David looked down, his voice soft. "It still stings sometimes. Not for me, but for every teacher who's been through it. Every person who's been made to feel small for doing honest work." Keanu turned to him, his voice steady but gentle. "That's why what you do matters. Because there's someone out there right now, watching your story, realizing they don't have to stay silent anymore." David smiled faintly. "You really think a story can do that?" Keanu glanced toward the school building, where the scholarship banner fluttered in the breeze. "I know it can, because stories remind us of who we are when the world forgets." The sky deepened into gold, then purple. A faint bell rang from somewhere nearby, marking the end of the school day. The playground was empty now, but its echo remained the sound of children's laughter lingering like a promise. Keanu rose slowly, dusting off his hands. "I should go." David stood as well. "You'll always have a place here, you know," Keanu smiled. "I'm just glad it's thriving." He looked around once more, taking in the sight of the school bathed in evening light. "You're doing holy work here, David. Don't ever doubt that." David extended his hand. "Thank you for everything." Keanu shook it firmly. "Thank you for reminding me what dignity looks like." As Keanu walked away, his figure grew smaller against the sunset. The fading light caught his silhouette, turning it into a quiet portrait of humility and grace. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The laughter, the hope, the change, it was all still behind him. Still alive. He paused for a moment at the edge of the schoolyard, glancing up at the painted mural of a teacher standing beside a child. Beneath it were the words, "Dignity begins with courage." Keanu read the phrase, smiled softly, and whispered, "That's the lesson." Then he turned and walked toward the fading light, the warm glow reflecting on his calm face. As the screen slowly darkened, his voice echoed faintly in reflection. "In a world that measures worth by wealth, never forget those who build it with wisdom. The real legacy isn't what you earn, it's what you uplift." A gentle piano melody swelled as the final message appeared on screen. If you believe teachers deserve respect, share this story and tell us who's the unsung hero in your life. The music lingered for a few moments before fading into silence, leaving behind only the feeling of warmth, gratitude, and quiet strength, an echo of dignity that would stay with the listener long after the video ended.